I'm done pretending my wife's chronic pain isn't just her avoiding responsibilities, because I've been doing everything alone for 3 years while she rates her suffering on Instagram. My wife, Vanessa, has been in pain for 3 years, according to her. She tells me every single day that her back hurts, or her neck is stiff, or her legs ache, or her shoulders are burning. I've watched her spend hours on the couch with heating pads and ice packs while I do the laundry and cook dinner and clean the house and work my full-time job. What really kills me is that she has enough energy to post about her pain on Instagram 3 times a day, with detailed captions about her suffering and photos of herself looking tragic in bed. She rates her pain level in every post. Pain level 8 today, can barely move. Then I come home and find her in the exact same position on the couch scrolling through her phone for the 4th hour straight. I've been doing everything in this house for 3 years, while she documents her misery for 2,000 followers who tell her how brave she is. Last month, our credit card bill was $340 over budget because of delivery fees alone. I'm cooking meals, and she's ordering smoothies and supplements from companies that sponsor chronic pain influencers. She spends $80 a month on special pillows that are supposed to help, but they just pile up on our bed. I sleep on 6 inches of mattress while she's surrounded by ergonomic support that doesn't seem to support anything except her online presence. When we first got married 4 years ago, Vanessa was different. She worked as a dental hygienist and came home tired but functional. We'd cook dinner together and talk about our days and go for walks in the evening. She was active and engaged, and I loved being with her. Then about a year into our marriage, she started complaining about back pain after long shifts at the dental office. She said leaning over patients all day was hurting her spine. I was sympathetic at first. I told her to see a doctor and take it easy. She went to her primary care physician, who said it was probably muscle strain, and recommended physical therapy. Vanessa went to exactly 3 physical therapy sessions and then stopped going. She said the exercises made her pain worse, and the therapist didn't understand how much she was suffering. That's when things started to change. She began calling in sick to work more frequently. Once a week, then twice a week, then 3 times a week. Her boss called me once to ask if Vanessa was okay because she'd missed so many days. I didn't know what to tell him. Vanessa would be on the couch when I left for work, and on the couch when I got home 8 hours later. She'd tell me she tried to get up, but the pain was too severe. She'd show me her phone where she'd been researching her symptoms and found 15 different conditions that matched what she was experiencing. 6 months after the back pain started, Vanessa quit her job entirely. She told me she physically couldn't do it anymore and that I needed to support her decision. I said we couldn't afford to live on one income, but she said her health was more important than money. She promised she'd find work she could do from home once she figured out how to manage her pain. That was 2.5 years ago. She hasn't worked a single day since then. Instead, she started the Instagram account. At first, it was just a few posts here and there about her struggles. Then it became her full-time occupation. She'd spend hours crafting the perfect caption about her pain levels and her doctor's appointments and her new symptoms. She joined online support groups for chronic pain sufferers and started using all their terminology. She talked about flare-ups and pain scales and spoon theory and good days versus bad days. Her followers grew from 50 to 500 to 2,000 people who all validated everything she said. They told her she was a warrior and an inspiration. They thanked her for making them feel less alone. She'd read me their comments with tears in her eyes and say this was her purpose now, helping other people understand chronic pain through sharing her journey. I wanted to be supportive, but I was drowning in responsibility while she got praise for posting selfies. The thing that makes me angriest is how selective her pain seems to be. She'll tell me she can't possibly vacuum the living room because bending over aggravates her back. But then I'll see her Instagram story showing her at Target browsing the home decor section for an hour. She'll say she can't do dishes because standing at the sink hurts her legs. But she'll stand in line at Starbucks for 20 minutes to get a specific seasonal drink for a photo. Last month, she told me she couldn't come to my company dinner because sitting in a restaurant chair would be torture for her back. The same night, I saw her post a photo from our friend Casey's birthday party at a loud bar where she'd apparently been sitting on a wooden stool for 3 hours. When I asked her about it, she said Casey's party was important for her mental health and that sometimes pushing through pain is necessary for meaningful social connection. But my work event where I was receiving an award wasn't important enough to push through for. I stood there alone while my colleagues asked where my wife was, and I had to make excuses. I'm tired of making excuses. I'm tired of being the only one who works and cleans and cooks and pays bills while she performs disability for strangers on the internet. 2 weeks ago was my breaking point. I'd worked a 10-hour shift and came home exhausted to find the house exactly as I'd left it that morning. Vanessa was on the couch in her pajamas with the TV on and her phone in her hand. Dishes were piled in the sink from 2 days ago. The laundry I'd asked her to fold was still in the basket untouched. I'd left a list of simple things she could do while I was at work. Just small tasks that didn't require much physical effort. Fold laundry, put dishes in the dishwasher, call the insurance company about a billing issue. She'd done exactly none of it. I asked her what she'd done all day and she looked at me with this exhausted expression and said she'd had a really bad pain day. She said she could barely get up to use the bathroom. I looked at her Instagram and saw she'd posted 4 times that day. One post was a photo of her heating pad with a caption about pain level 9. Another was a selfie with a sad face, talking about how hard it is when people don't understand invisible illness. The third was a photo of her journal where she'd written about her symptoms. The fourth was a video of her cat cuddling with her with a caption about how animals understand pain better than humans do. She'd had enough energy to create content for hundreds of strangers, but not enough to fold a single load of laundry for her husband, who was working himself to death to keep us afloat. I didn't say anything that night. I just made dinner and did the dishes and folded the laundry myself. I went to bed angry and woke up angry and went to work angry. The anger has been building for 3 years, but that night, something shifted. I started paying closer attention to the inconsistencies. I started keeping track of what Vanessa said she couldn't do versus what she actually did when she thought I wasn't watching, or when she wanted to do something for herself. The pattern became impossible to ignore. She couldn't help me carry groceries in from the car because lifting hurt her back, but she could lift her 15-pound dumbbells for an Instagram video about trying to stay active despite chronic pain. She couldn't come with me to Home Depot to pick out new curtains because walking around stores was too painful. But she could walk around the mall for 2 hours with her friend Jenna looking at clothes. She couldn't meal prep on Sunday because standing and chopping vegetables would trigger a flare-up. But she could stand at the bathroom counter for 40 minutes doing her makeup for a coffee date. Every single limitation she claimed disappeared when it was something she actually wanted to do. The pain was only insurmountable when it came to household responsibilities or supporting me in any way. I started talking to my brother about what was happening because I felt like I was going crazy. He's a physical therapist and he's seen a lot of patients with chronic pain over his 15-year career. I told him about Vanessa's symptoms and her inconsistent limitations and her Instagram documentation. He listened without interrupting and then said something that made my stomach drop. He said it sounded like Vanessa might be dealing with something psychological rather than purely physical. He explained that some people develop real pain as a response to trauma or anxiety or depression. The pain isn't fake, but it's not caused by a structural problem that doctors can fix. He said these patients often doctor shop looking for someone to validate their suffering because they desperately need their pain to be taken seriously. He said social media had made it worse because people could find entire communities that would tell them their pain was valid without ever questioning whether they were getting appropriate treatment. He asked if Vanessa had ever seen a psychiatrist or a therapist who specialized in chronic pain. I told him she'd refuse to see anyone who suggested her pain might have a psychological component because she said that was dismissive of her physical suffering. My brother said that was a red flag. He said effective chronic pain treatment almost always involved addressing both physical and mental health. Refusing to consider the psychological aspect meant Vanessa wasn't actually trying to get better. She was just trying to be validated. After talking to my brother, I felt this combination of relief and rage. Relief because maybe I wasn't a terrible husband for doubting my wife's pain. Rage because if my brother was right, then Vanessa had been using her pain as an excuse to opt out of our marriage for 3 years. I went home that night planning to have a serious conversation with her. I walked in and found her on the couch editing photos on her phone. She'd taken a series of selfies, showing her face scrunched up in supposed agony with captions ready to post about how difficult the day had been. I stood there watching her adjust the lighting and add filters to make herself look more pale and suffering. She was literally staging her pain for content. Something in me snapped. I asked her if she'd done any of the things on the list I'd left. She said no and started to explain about her pain levels, but I cut her off. I told her I didn't believe her anymore. I said I'd been watching how her limitations only applied to helping me, but disappeared when it was something she wanted to do. I said I thought she was using her pain as an excuse to avoid being a partner in this marriage. The words came out harsh and loud, and I didn't try to soften them. I was done being gentle about this. Vanessa's face went white and then red. She started crying and saying I was just like everyone else who didn't believe people with invisible illnesses. She said I was supposed to be her support system, and instead, I was attacking her when she was at her most vulnerable. She grabbed her phone and showed me messages from her Instagram followers thanking her for her honesty. She said these strangers understood her better than her own husband did. I told her that was because strangers only saw the curated version of her life, where she was a brave pain warrior. They didn't see her refusing to contribute anything to our household, while I worked myself to exhaustion. They didn't see her walking around Target just fine, but claiming she couldn't load the dishwasher. I told her I thought she needed to see a therapist who specialized in chronic pain, and that if she wasn't willing to actually try to get better, then I wasn't willing to keep enabling her. She screamed that I was calling her a liar, and that she couldn't believe I would be so cruel. She said pain was subjective, and just because I couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't real. I said I understood that, but I also wasn't going to pretend that her Instagram performance and her actual daily life made any sense together. I told her something had to change, or I was done. The fight lasted 2 hours and ended with Vanessa locking herself in the bedroom and me sleeping on the couch. I barely slept because I kept replaying everything I'd said and wondering if I'd been too harsh. Maybe she really was in pain and I was being an insensitive asshole. Maybe I was the problem for not being more understanding. But then, I'd remember watching her stage photos of her suffering while dishes rotted in the sink, and I'd get angry all over again. The next morning, Vanessa came out of the bedroom and told me coldly that she was going to stay at her mother's house for a few days because she couldn't be around someone who thought she was faking. I said that was fine. She packed a bag and left without saying goodbye. I stood in the kitchen feeling this weird mixture of guilt and relief. The house was quiet without her. I did the dishes and the laundry and vacuumed, and it felt good to have the space clean even though I was the one doing all the work. I made dinner for myself and ate in silence. I didn't miss her. That realization hit me hard. I didn't miss my wife after 3 years of marriage. What did that say about us? Vanessa's mother called me 2 days later and I braced myself for a lecture about how I was treating her daughter. Instead, Margaret's voice was careful and concerned in a way I didn't expect. She said Vanessa had told her about our fight and that Margaret wanted to understand my side of things. I was suspicious at first because Vanessa and her mother were extremely close. But Margaret kept asking specific questions about what Vanessa was and wasn't able to do. She asked if Vanessa was seeing doctors regularly. I told her Vanessa had been to maybe 15 different doctors over the past 3 years, but never went back for follow-up appointments if they suggested physical therapy or psychiatric evaluation. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that changed everything. She said she needed to tell me something about Vanessa's childhood that might explain what was happening now. She asked me to come to her house so we could talk in person. I drove over that evening with my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect. Margaret made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table while Vanessa was in the other room watching TV. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her mug. She told me that when Vanessa was 11 years old, she'd been in a serious car accident. Margaret's ex-husband had been driving and he'd been drinking, though they didn't find that out until later. They'd been T-boned at an intersection, and Vanessa had been in the back seat. She'd suffered a broken collarbone and 3 cracked ribs and a severe concussion. She'd been in the hospital for a week and had spent months in physical therapy recovering. Margaret said the physical injuries healed, but something else happened during that time. Vanessa's father had been arrested for DUI and vehicular endangerment. The court case dragged on for 8 months. During that time, Vanessa started having panic attacks and nightmares. She also started complaining of pain in her ribs and back, even though the doctors said she was physically healed. Margaret took her to a child psychologist who explained that Vanessa was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. The pain she felt was real, but it was her nervous system stuck in a state of high alert after the trauma. The psychologist worked with Vanessa for about a year, and the pain gradually decreased. Vanessa seemed to recover and went back to being a normal kid. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she continued the story. She said Vanessa's father went to prison for 18 months. When he got out, he wanted to be part of Vanessa's life again. Margaret was against it, but Vanessa was 13 by then and said she wanted to see her father. The visits were supervised at first, but eventually Vanessa started spending weekends at his apartment. One weekend when Vanessa was 15, she came home from her father's place barely able to walk. She said her back hurt so badly she couldn't stand up straight. They rushed her to the emergency room thinking something terrible had happened. The doctors ran tests but couldn't find anything physically wrong. They gave her pain medication and muscle relaxers and sent her home. Vanessa never told Margaret what happened that weekend, and she refused to go back to her father's house ever again. She also refused to talk about it with the therapist. Margaret said she suspected something bad had happened, but Vanessa shut down completely whenever the subject came up. After that weekend, the chronic pain started and never really stopped. Vanessa would have good periods and bad periods, but the pain was always there in the background. It got worse when she was stressed or anxious. Margaret said she'd tried to get Vanessa to see therapists over the years, but Vanessa insisted the pain was purely physical and that therapy was useless for real injuries. I sat at Margaret's kitchen table feeling like the world had tilted sideways. Vanessa had never told me any of this. I knew her parents were divorced and that she wasn't close with her father, but I didn't know about the accident or the trauma or the suspected abuse. Margaret said she should have told me before we got married, but Vanessa had made her promise not to say anything because she didn't want me to see her as damaged or broken. Margaret said watching what had been happening over the past 3 years had become unbearable. She said Vanessa's pain was real, but it wasn't going to get better until she dealt with the trauma underneath it. She said Vanessa needed serious psychological help, but she wouldn't accept it from her mother. Margaret thought maybe Vanessa would listen to me if I approached it the right way. I left Margaret's house feeling completely gutted. Everything I'd said to Vanessa about her faking suddenly sounded cruel and dismissive in a way I hadn't understood before. Her pain was real. It just wasn't caused by the physical problems she kept looking for. She'd been suffering for years with something that doctors couldn't fix with medication or heating pads or special pillows, and I'd accused her of lying instead of trying to understand what was actually happening. I called my brother that night and told him everything Margaret had said. He wasn't surprised. He said complex trauma often manifested as chronic pain that was completely real to the person experiencing it. He explained that when someone experiences severe trauma, especially as a child, their nervous system can get stuck in a state where it interprets normal sensations as danger signals. The brain creates real pain as a protective mechanism. The pain isn't imagined or fake, but it's also not caused by tissue damage that shows up on scans. He said the Instagram posting and the doctor shopping and the refusal to consider psychological treatment were all ways Vanessa was trying to make her pain legitimate in a world that dismisses women's pain generally and psychological pain specifically. He said she needed trauma therapy more than she needed another specialist to tell her nothing was structurally wrong. I asked him what I was supposed to do now. He said I needed to apologize for how I'd approached the conversation with Vanessa, but I also needed to hold firm on the boundary that she had to get real help. He said living with chronic pain was hard, but it didn't absolve Vanessa of being a partner in the marriage. She could be in pain and still contribute. She could be suffering and still see a trauma therapist. The pain wasn't an excuse to completely opt out of life. The next day, I drove to Margaret's house and asked to talk to Vanessa. She came out looking defensive and exhausted. I asked if we could go somewhere private, and she reluctantly agreed to go for a drive with me. We drove to a park and sat on a bench overlooking the lake. I told her that Margaret had told me about the car accident and what happened when she was 15. Vanessa's face went pale and then furious. She said her mother had no right to share her private history. She said I'd manipulated Margaret into betraying her trust. I said I hadn't manipulated anyone and that Margaret was worried about her daughter. I told Vanessa I was sorry for the way I'd confronted her and for accusing her of faking. I said I believed her pain was real, but I also believed it wasn't going to get better without addressing the trauma underneath it. Vanessa started crying and said she knew the pain was connected to what happened, but she couldn't talk about it. She said every time she tried to think about that weekend with her father, she felt like she was drowning. She said the pain got worse when she thought about it, so she'd learned to just not think about it at all. I asked if that was working for her. She sobbed and said no. She said she felt trapped in her own body and didn't know how to escape. We sat on that bench for 2 hours while Vanessa told me pieces of what she'd been carrying. She said her father had been drunk that weekend and had gotten angry at her for some small thing. He'd shoved her hard against a wall and she'd hit her back. That's when the pain started. But worse than the physical injury was the betrayal of someone who was supposed to protect her, hurting her instead. She said she'd felt guilty for years, thinking she must have done something to deserve it. She'd never told Margaret the full story because she didn't want to hurt her mother more by confirming what had happened. She'd tried to just push it all down and move forward. It had worked okay for a while. The pain would come and go, but she could mostly manage it. But when she started working as a dental hygienist and had to lean over patients in positions that reminded her body of being trapped against that wall, the pain had become unbearable. She'd started having panic attacks at work that she hid from everyone. Eventually, she couldn't make herself go in anymore. The Instagram had started as a way to document her symptoms for doctors, but it had become something else. It was the only place she felt believed and validated. It was the only place where her suffering mattered to people. She said she knew it had taken over her life, but she didn't know how to stop. I held Vanessa while she cried and felt completely overwhelmed by everything she'd been carrying alone. I told her I understood now why she'd been so resistant to therapy, but that she needed it anyway. I said I couldn't keep being the only one holding our life together while she documented her pain for strangers. I said I loved her, but I needed her to fight for herself and for us. She said she was scared that if she dealt with the trauma, the pain might get worse before it got better. I said it might, but that we'd figure it out together. She said she didn't know if she could trust me anymore after I'd accused her of faking. I said I understood that and I was sorry, but we had to start somewhere. We agreed that we'd go to couples therapy together and that Vanessa would find a trauma therapist who specialized in chronic pain. She said she'd try, but she couldn't promise anything. I said trying was all I was asking for. We drove back to Margaret's house, and I told Vanessa to stay there a few more days while I looked into therapists and got things set up. She agreed and hugged me before going inside. I drove home feeling cautiously hopeful for the first time in years. I spent the next week researching therapists and reading everything I could find about trauma-based chronic pain. The more I learned, the more Vanessa's behavior made sense. The Instagram wasn't just attention-seeking. It was a way to make her pain visible to a world that kept telling her nothing was wrong. The doctor shopping wasn't manipulation. It was desperation to find someone who would take her seriously and give her a solution. The resistance to psychological treatment wasn't stubbornness. It was terror of facing something so painful that her brain had created a physical wall to protect her from it. I'd been seeing Vanessa's symptoms as personal attacks against me when they were actually survival mechanisms she'd developed to cope with trauma I hadn't known existed. I felt guilty for every frustrated thought I'd had about her, and every moment I'd resented her for not pulling her weight. She hadn't been avoiding responsibility. She'd been barely surviving something I couldn't see. I found a therapist named Dr. Simmons who specialized in trauma and chronic pain. I called her office and explained the situation. She said she had a cancellation the following week and could see Vanessa and me together for an initial consultation. I also found a couples therapist named Dr. Torres, who had experience working with couples dealing with chronic illness. I scheduled an appointment with her for the week after. I called Vanessa and told her what I'd set up. She was quiet for a long moment and then said, okay. Just okay. But it was enough. She came home 2 days before the first appointment, and we existed in this careful, quiet space together. We didn't talk much. We didn't touch. We just coexisted while we both processed everything that had come out. I made dinner and did the dishes, and she didn't post on Instagram at all for those 2 days. I noticed, but didn't comment on it. The appointment with Dr. Simmons was intense. She was probably in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that made me feel like maybe we'd found the right person. She asked Vanessa to tell her history, and Vanessa cried through most of it, but she told the full story, including details about her father, that made my hands clench into fists. Dr. Simmons listened without interrupting and took notes. When Vanessa finished, Dr. Simmons explained that she was experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder with somatic symptoms. She said the pain was a real neurological phenomenon caused by a nervous system that was stuck in a prolonged state of alarm. She said traditional pain management wouldn't work because there was no structural problem to fix. What Vanessa needed was trauma processing therapy to help her nervous system understand that she was safe now. Dr. Simmons said it wouldn't be easy or fast. Trauma work was painful, and Vanessa's symptoms might actually get worse before they got better, as she processed what had happened. But if Vanessa was willing to do the work, there was a good chance her pain levels would decrease significantly over time. She said they'd start with twice-weekly sessions and reassess after 3 months. Vanessa agreed and scheduled her next appointment before we left. The couple's therapy with Dr. Torres was different. She focused less on Vanessa's pain and more on our communication patterns. She pointed out that I'd been playing the role of caretaker and parent rather than partner. She said I'd taken on all the responsibility without ever directly asking Vanessa what she was actually capable of doing on her good days. She said Vanessa had been using her pain as a shield against expectations and intimacy. Neither pattern was healthy. Dr. Torres gave us homework assignments that felt silly at first. We had to have a daily check-in where we each shared our emotional state and one thing we appreciated about the other. We had to take turns planning a simple activity we could do together that worked within Vanessa's physical limitations. We had to practice asking for what we needed instead of assuming the other person should know. The exercises forced us to actually talk to each other instead of just coexisting in resentful silence. Vanessa's trauma therapy was brutal. She'd come home from sessions completely drained and would spend the rest of the day in bed crying. The pain actually did get worse initially, just as Dr. Simmons had warned. Vanessa would have episodes where she couldn't move because her back was spasming so badly. I'd help her through them with heating pads and gentle stretching and just being present. It was hard to watch, but I kept reminding myself that this was part of healing. Dr. Simmons had warned us that as Vanessa started processing the trauma her body had been holding, the pain would intensify temporarily as the nervous system recalibrated. After about 6 weeks, Vanessa started having her first genuinely good days. Not days where she was pushing through pain, but days where the pain was actually at a level 2 or 3 instead of constantly at a 7 or 8. She was careful at first, almost superstitious about mentioning it, in case talking about feeling better would make the pain come back. But the good days started happening more frequently. Something else changed too. Vanessa stopped posting on Instagram. At first I thought it was temporary, but days turned into weeks, and her account stayed quiet. I finally asked her about it one night, while we were making dinner together for the first time in years. She was chopping vegetables slowly and carefully while I handled the stove. She said the Instagram had been a way to make her pain matter when she felt invisible everywhere else. But now that she was actually dealing with her trauma and making progress, she didn't need strangers to validate her suffering anymore. She said looking back at her old posts made her feel sad because she could see how much she'd been screaming for help without actually asking for it. She'd been performing her pain instead of healing from it. She said she wasn't sure if she'd ever post again or if she'd just delete the account. I told her it was her decision and I'd support whatever she chose. She eventually deleted it about a month later. She said keeping it felt like holding on to a version of herself she didn't want to be anymore. 3 months into therapy, Vanessa started talking about going back to work. Not as a dental hygienist, because the physical demands of that job had been triggering for her in ways she now understood, but maybe something administrative or remote that would let her contribute financially without requiring her to put her body in positions that reminded her nervous system of being trapped. We spent several evenings looking at job postings together and working on her resume. She applied to about 20 positions and got 3 interviews. The first 2 didn't work out, but the third was for a customer service role at an insurance company that was fully remote. She got the job and started 2 weeks later. The first few weeks were hard. She'd finish her shift exhausted and need to rest for several hours, but she stuck with it. She was determined to prove to herself that she could function even with the pain. Having a routine and a purpose outside of documenting her suffering made a visible difference. She smiled more. She had energy for conversations. She started caring about things beyond her pain levels. 6 months into therapy, Dr. Simmons introduced EMDR, which was this specific technique for processing trauma. Vanessa would come home from those sessions looking like she'd been hit by a truck, but she said something was shifting. She said she was starting to separate the memories from the pain. Her back still hurt sometimes, but it wasn't the constant scream it had been before. She could identify when the pain was her body reacting to stress versus actual physical strain. That awareness gave her some control back. She started doing gentle yoga, which Dr. Simmons had recommended. At first, she could barely do 5 minutes before her back would seize up. But slowly, she built up to 15 minutes, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes. She was rebuilding trust with her own body, teaching it that movement didn't equal danger. Our couple's therapy was showing results too. We were actually talking to each other about difficult things instead of letting resentment build. When I felt overwhelmed by everything I was carrying, I said it directly, instead of being passive-aggressive. When Vanessa was having a bad pain day, she told me what she needed instead of just shutting down. We were learning to be honest with each other. One evening, about 8 months into Vanessa's trauma therapy, I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out everywhere. She'd been researching chronic pain support groups and advocacy organizations. Real ones that focused on proper treatment and trauma-informed care, not just Instagram communities that validated suffering without promoting healing. She said she wanted to help other people who were struggling with pain that had traumatic roots. She said she'd wasted 3 years of her life avoiding the real work of healing, and she didn't want other people to make the same mistake. She was thinking about training to become a peer support specialist once she got further in her own recovery. I sat down across from her and told her I was proud of her. She started crying and said she didn't deserve my support after everything she'd put me through. I told her we'd both made mistakes. I'd been dismissive and impatient, and I'd accused her of lying when she was suffering from something I didn't understand. She'd used her pain as a shield against intimacy and responsibility when what we both needed was honesty. We were both learning to do better. Our first anniversary of actually working on our marriage felt more significant than our original wedding anniversary. We'd spent the past year doing the hardest work either of us had ever done. Vanessa had faced trauma she'd been running from for over a decade. I'd confronted my own impatience and lack of empathy. We'd learned to communicate instead of assuming. We'd built new patterns together. We went to dinner at a quiet restaurant, and Vanessa ordered without checking if the chairs were ergonomically correct or asking about accommodations for her pain. She sat through the meal and talked and laughed and didn't wince constantly or shift positions every few minutes. Afterward, we walked along the waterfront, holding hands. The old Vanessa couldn't have done this. The Vanessa from a year ago would have insisted on leaving early and would have posted about how difficult it was to maintain a social life with chronic pain. This Vanessa was present and engaged and genuinely enjoying herself. When we got home, she helped me clean up the kitchen and load the dishwasher. Such a small thing, but it meant everything. We were finally partners again. A year and a half into therapy, Vanessa got promoted at work. Her supervisor said she was one of the most reliable and efficient people on the team. Vanessa came home that day beaming with pride. She'd proven to herself that she could show up and perform and be valued for something other than her suffering. Her pain levels were down to baseline 2 or 3 most days, with occasional flare-ups when she was stressed or anxious. But now she had tools to manage it. She could recognize when her nervous system was reacting to a trigger versus actual physical injury. She could use breathing techniques and grounding exercises to calm her body down. She still saw Dr. Simmons once a week, but they were working on maintenance and coping strategies rather than acute trauma processing. Vanessa started volunteering with a local chronic pain support group that focused on trauma-informed treatment. She'd share her story with newly diagnosed patients and help them understand the connection between trauma and pain. She told me it felt good to turn her suffering into something that could help others. She wasn't performing pain for an audience anymore. She was using her experience to guide people toward actual healing. 2 years after that conversation on the park bench, where everything changed, we hosted a dinner party at our house. It was the first time we'd had people over since before Vanessa quit her job. She planned the menu and helped cook and set the table and greeted our guests with genuine warmth. She made it through the entire evening without needing to excuse herself to lie down. She was present and funny and engaged. After everyone left, we cleaned up the kitchen together, and Vanessa said she couldn't believe how different her life was now compared to 2 years ago. She said she'd thought she was going to be in debilitating pain forever. She'd thought her only identity was as a chronic pain sufferer. She'd built her entire online presence around being sick. But now, she had her life back, not because the pain disappeared completely, but because she'd done the work to understand why it existed and how to live with it. I told her I was proud of how hard she'd fought to get here. She told me she was grateful I hadn't given up on her, even when she'd given up on herself. We went to bed that night as actual partners in a real marriage instead of strangers coexisting in a shared space. 3 years after Margaret's phone call that changed everything, Vanessa finished her training as a certified peer support specialist for chronic pain patients. She got hired part-time at a pain management clinic to work with patients whose pain had psychological components. She told me it felt full circle to be on the other side now, helping people recognize that their pain was real and valid while also gently guiding them toward trauma-informed treatment. Our marriage wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was honest and functional and built on actual communication instead of resentment and assumptions. Vanessa still had bad pain days occasionally, and on those days I helped her through them with compassion instead of frustration. I still got overwhelmed sometimes with work and responsibilities, and on those days Vanessa picked up the slack instead of retreating into her pain. We'd learned to support each other through difficult things instead of letting them destroy us. The Instagram account stayed deleted, and Vanessa never looked back. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.